Chapter 1. Blood always tastes like old copper and unpaid debts. I swung the grease-stained wrench with every ounce of my fading strength. It collided with the enforcer's kneecap, echoing with a sickening fractured snap. The brute dropped his kerosene canister, howling into the damp alleyway. Survival in the lower rings of the city was never a debate of morality. It was simple math, a blind strike against a crushing force. There were 3 left. Debt collectors working for the local syndicates, sent to burn my diner to ashes. They brought a pit hound, a snarling beast built for tearing flesh. Yet as I gripped my weapon, the beast did the unthinkable. It did not lunge. The hound flattened its ears, tucked its tail, and pressed its belly against the asphalt, whining softly in my direction. Before I could process the anomaly, the air pressure vanished. The scent of scorched pine and violent lightning swallowed the alley. A shadow blotted out the street lamps, descending from the fire escape with the velocity of a falling star. The earth cracked beneath his boots. It was him, Vane, the apex predator of Obsidian Ridge. But he was not the composed tyrant from the holocausts. He was completely feral. The Sun Devourer curse, a lethal affliction whispered about in dark corners, was actively tearing him apart. Molten heat radiated from his towering frame. Veins like glowing embers spiderwebbed up his neck, burning through his charcoal suit. His amber eyes were entirely blown out, pupils dilated into bottomless voids of predatory madness. He moved faster than human sight. Before I could raise the wrench, his hand clamped around my throat. I was yanked off the ground. My boots kicked empty air. His grip was an iron vice, blistering hot. The scent of his burning skin filled my lungs. I was going to die right here, a meaningless casualty to an alpha's broken mind. Not like this. Not for them. I did not scream. I refused to give him the satisfaction. Instead, my calloused hands instinctively flew up. I gripped his wrists, my fingertips pressing directly into the glowing, corrupted veins of his forearms. The heat didn't burn me. It recognized me. The reaction was instantaneous. A sharp, icy jolt sparked from my palms. It rushed into his bloodstream. The violent red embers beneath his skin hissed, retreating instantly like fire fleeing from a sudden ocean wave. The blistering heat radiating from his flesh plummeted to a soothing, steady warmth. Vane gasped. The feral fog shattered. His golden eyes snapped back into focus, locking onto mine with absolute paralyzing shock. For a fraction of a second, an ocean of unspoken vulnerability passed between us. He looked at me like he had just found something he had been starving for his entire life. He felt it, the impossible serenity spreading through his cursed veins. Then the mask slammed back into place. He released my throat as if my skin had burned him. I crashed to the asphalt, coughing violently, dragging the bitter air back into my starved lungs. Vane stumbled back, his jaw tightened into a rigid line. He refused to look at my gasping form, his chest rising and falling in sharp, erratic rhythms. Reaching into his ruined coat, he pulled out a pristine leather-bound folder and tossed it onto the wet pavement near my knees. "Your debts are foreclosed." His voice was a low glacial rumble, devoid of the madness from seconds ago. "The property belongs to Obsidian Ridge now. You are evicted." He was lying. I could see the frantic pulse beating at the base of his throat. He was trying to sever the connection, to build a fortress of cruelty over the inexplicable salvation he had just felt. I did not cry. Tears were a luxury the streets had long ago beaten out of me. I pushed myself up, my knees scraping against the gravel. I looked at the man who had just tried to kill me, and that was when I saw it. The cuff of his ruined sleeve was torn. Etched into the pale skin of his inner wrist was a distinct silver crescent scar. The pieces violently snapped together, the feral scent, the amber eyes, the silent boy bleeding out in the shadows behind the dumpster 15 years ago, the one I had smuggled stolen bread to under the cover of night. He turned his back to me, his dark coat sweeping over the debris, preparing to vanish into the city's smog. I wiped the blood from my mouth. My voice cut through the damp air sharp as a blade. The crescent scar on your wrist. Vane froze mid-step, every muscle in his imposing back locked entirely. That wild boy from the alleyway years ago, I whispered, holding his gaze even though he refused to turn around. He would never steal the absolute last thing I have left in this world. He did not speak, his hands curled into tight fists, his knuckles turning stark white. He stood there for 3 agonizing heartbeats, the silence stretching taut between us. Then he walked away, like leaving was the only thing keeping him from coming back for me. But the warmth he left behind on my skin refused to fade. Chapter 2. Bypassing the biometric scanners of the Obsidian Ridge Tower required 3 spliced wires, a stolen key card, and an absolute disregard for my own life. The monolithic glass doors of the penthouse slid open with a soft hiss. The air up here was incredibly thin, suffocating in its sterile, manufactured perfection. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the sprawling, neon-soaked ruins of the lower rings, yet my eyes bypassed the city entirely, locking onto the apex predator sitting behind the colossal obsidian desk. Vane. He did not look up from the glowing holopad. He wore a crisp, midnight blue suit, the very picture of a flawless corporate monarch. But the illusion was shattered for me. I knew exactly what lurked beneath the expensive silk. I knew the feral, fractured beast that had nearly burned us both to ash just hours ago. Breaking into an alpha's inner sanctum, his voice was a smooth, dangerous purr that skated along the edge of a jagged blade. That is a guaranteed death sentence, little bird. You bought my debt to ruin me, I countered, keeping my chin raised despite the frantic rhythm hammering against my collarbone. I came to negotiate. He finally lifted his gaze. Those golden eyes were glacial now, calculated and utterly empty. It was a terrifying contrast to the starved desperation I had seen in the alleyway. There is no negotiation, Vane stated, leaning back into his leather chair. You owe 50,000 credits. You will work it off here on this floor as my personal attendant, or you will rot in the subterranean prisons. Choose. It was a cage, a gilded trap forged from legal contracts and unspoken obsessions. He was forcing me into his territory, keeping me chained to his side, though neither of us dared to admit the terrifying pull dragging us together. Fine, I clipped out. I grabbed a linen cloth from a nearby silver serving cart. Where do I start? The archives, he commanded, his gaze dropping back to his screen, like I was nothing more than an afterthought. I turned away, my boots sinking into the plush carpet as I approached the imposing mahogany bookshelves framing the far wall. The silence in the penthouse was leaden, stretching tight enough to snap. I focused on the mundane task, wiping down the leather spines of ancient texts, trying to calm the erratic spiking of my pulse. Then, something caught the ambient light. Resting on the very corner of his sprawling desk, protected beneath a reinforced glass dome, was a single, yellowed object. A folded paper crane. My breath hitched in my throat. The creases were faded, the cheap newspaper edges worn soft from years of being relentlessly handled. It was the exact crane I had folded with blood-stained fingers and tucked into the hollow of a rotting oak tree 15 years ago. the secret drop point where I used to leave stolen bread for a dying, wild boy. He kept it. The most ruthless alpha in the country had built a bulletproof shrine to a ghost. I swallowed the sharp knot forming in my throat and reached up on my tiptoes to clean the highest shelf. My back was completely turned to him. I was exposed, vulnerable. Before I could lower my arm, the air pressure in the room entirely vanished. I did not hear his footsteps. A predator of his caliber made no sound when stalking his claim, but my body recognized him instantly. The ambient temperature spiked. A wave of suffocating electric heat rolled over my bare shoulders. Vane was standing directly behind me. Less than an inch of empty space separated my spine from his chest. I froze, my hands suspended in midair. I could feel the searing, unnatural heat radiating from his towering frame, bleeding right through the thin fabric of my shirt. He lowered his head. I felt the phantom brush of his nose grazing the sensitive skin right beneath my ear. He inhaled deeply. It was a long, possessive draw of breath, pulling the scent of my racing pulse and sheer terror deep into his lungs. A low, animalistic rumble vibrated from his chest, resonating directly into my marrow. He was fighting a losing battle. I could hear it, the faint, horrifying sound of sizzling flesh. The Sun-Devourer curse was flaring back to life, enraged by his absolute refusal to close the final millimeter between us. Glowing red heat illuminated the periphery of my vision, reflecting off the polished wood. He was literally burning his own skin to cinders from the inside out, enduring agonizing torture just to keep from hurting me. Vane, I breathed, the whisper trembling on my lips like a prayer. The danger was blindingly intoxicating. My knees turned to water. The dormant power hidden deep in my veins, the same icy salvation that had quelled his madness yesterday, thrummed with sudden life. I swayed back, just a fraction, craving the violent collision of our bodies. Before my shoulders could meet his chest, the temperature in the penthouse violently plummeted to absolute zero. A thick layer of white frost instantly crawled up the floor-to-ceiling windows, cracking the reinforced glass with a sharp, deafening splinter. The intoxicating scent of scorched pine was brutally severed by the sterile, biting reek of liquid nitrogen. Vane instantly stepped back. The searing heat vanished, replaced by an agonizing cold. I spun around, clutching the linen cloth to my chest, my breathing ragged. The double doors of the office stood wide open. A woman strolled in, wrapped in a shimmering coat of white mink. Her eyes were chips of glacial ice, her beauty sharp enough to draw blood. Every step she took left a frozen, dying footprint on the plush carpet. Odette, the Ice Wolf Queen. She did not even look at me. She walked straight to Vane, her perfectly manicured fingers sliding intimately down his arm, hooking through his elbow with ironclad ownership. "Husband," Odette smiled, her voice dripping with venomous, chilling sweetness. "My ice heart relic is losing power. The curse is making you reckless again." Her icy gaze finally flicked over to me, sweeping up and down my cheap clothing with utter, absolute disgust. "Do not let this mortal brat sully our bridal suite. We have a wedding to finalize." Chapter 3. The temperature drop was not merely an atmospheric shift. It was a calculated weapon. Odette smiled, but her eyes were lethal. She stepped closer to Vane, her manicured fingers trailing over the lapel of his suit. Hanging against her pale collarbone was the ice heart, a crystalline relic radiating a blinding, freezing mist. She deliberately severed the relic's outward flow. The suppression vanished. The Sun-Devourer curse, denied its icy cage, violently clawed its way back to the surface. Vane flinched. The glowing, corrupted veins erupted across his neck, clashing brutally with the lingering frost. The sudden thermal shock split his skin open. A sharp metallic scent of fresh blood and burning ozone flooded the penthouse. The Alpha King of Obsidian Ridge dropped to one knee. The impact fractured the obsidian floor tiles beneath him. His jaw locked, teeth grinding together to hold back a feral roar of pure agony. He was a proud, towering king, forced into agonizing submission. "Do try to survive until the ceremony, my king," Odette whispered softly. She patted his trembling shoulder, utterly indifferent to the blood trickling from his split lip. She turned on her heel and swept out of the room, her icy coat trailing behind her. The heavy double doors clicked shut. Once she was gone, Vane completely collapsed. A guttural, tortured sound tore from his throat. The curse was actively devouring him from the inside out. His fingers dug into the carpet, scorching the fibers to black ash. I stood paralyzed behind the mahogany shelf. My nails dug desperately into the wooden edge. Right next to my trembling hand, a potted midnight orchid had been snap-frozen by Odette's entrance. Its delicate petals were entombed in solid rime. As my fingers accidentally brushed the dead, frozen stem, a strange, undeniable pulse thrummed beneath my skin. The ice shattered. A vibrant, silver-laced energy traveled down my arm and poured into the plant. The black petals instantly unfolded, blooming with an unnatural, vibrant life. I stared at my palms. A dormant, impossible truth was waking up inside my blood, but there was no time to question it. I abandoned my hiding spot and sprinted across the ruined floor. I dropped to my knees beside the burning Alpha. "Do not touch me," Vane rasped. His voice was a gravelly, broken echo. His amber eyes were wildly dilated, tracking the violent tremors in his own hands. The heat radiating off him was lethal. "Get out. I will kill you." I ignored the warning. I lunged forward and threw my arms around his broad, trembling shoulders. I pulled his burning torso flush against my chest. The impact of the collision was explosive. The same silver warmth that had revived the orchid surged outward from my core. It flooded his boiling bloodstream. The blistering, deadly heat vanished in a fraction of a second. It was violently replaced by a profound, echoing serenity. The angry red veins under his skin faded into nothingness. Vane went entirely rigid. For one suspended second, the world simply stopped spinning. Then, the fight completely left his imposing frame. He slumped forward, entirely drained, his face buried directly into the curve of my neck. He let out a fractured, devastating exhale. The apex predator of the city surrendered. His arms instinctively wrapped around my waist, his grip tightening like a drowning man clutching his only lifeline. He buried his nose deeper against my collarbone, breathing in my scent with frantic, starving desperation. His heartbeat drummed against my ribcage, slowing from a terrifying gallop to a steady, rhythmic thud. I ran my fingers through his dark hair. I understood the terrifying reality now. He had not submitted to Odette for political power. He endured her torture strictly to survive. He was keeping the Ice Wolf Queen close because her relic was the only thing stopping the curse from turning him into ash. Until me. The office doors swung open without a single sound. I flinched, instinctively tightening my protective hold on Vane. A man stepped out of the shadows of the corridor. He wore a tailored charcoal vest, a silver-tipped cane tapping lightly against the floor. Huxley, Vane's chief investment officer, and the most lethal dark mage in the entire territory. Huxley's pale, calculating eyes darted from the magically revived orchid on the shelf to the impossible sight of his feral alpha clinging to a mortal girl. the mage's stoic face, immediately drained of all color. He locked the door behind him and stepped closer. His voice dropped to a terrifying, deadly whisper. "If Odette discovers you are a living curse filter," Huxley warned, staring directly into my eyes, "she will carve you into 1,000 pieces before dawn. Pontemore." Huxley's warning hung in the freezing air like a guillotine blade. Before I could fully process the lethal threat, the impossible warmth radiating from Vane violently vanished. He ripped himself away from my embrace. The sudden loss of contact left my skin feeling bruised and hollow. Vane stumbled backward. The terrifying vulnerability I had just witnessed was erased in a fraction of a second. His golden eyes hardened into glacial, unyielding voids. He straightened his ruined suit, his towering silhouette casting a long, imposing shadow over me. The Alpha King was back, and he was looking at me like I was a disease. "Huxley," Vane commanded. His voice was a dead, hollow rumble that offered absolutely no mercy. "Escort this trash out of my territory." I flinched. The words hit harder than the enforcer's iron wrench. "Vane, you don't have to do this. I can fix the curse." "Fix me," he scoffed, a cruel razor-sharp sound that cut straight to my marrow. "You possess delusions of grandeur, little bird." He turned his back on me and walked to the obsidian desk, his ruthless gaze locked onto the glass dome protecting the yellowed paper crane, the single fragile monument to the boy he used to be. He did not hesitate. Vane brought his fist down. The reinforced glass exploded into 1,000 glittering shards. I gasped, taking an involuntary step forward. He reached into the jagged wreckage and pulled out the delicate 15-year-old memory. "You think you matter because of a pathetic childhood mistake?" He held the crane up. His amber eyes bored into mine. They were entirely empty. He tore the paper in half. The sound of the tearing parchment was deafening in the silent penthouse. He dropped the shredded pieces onto the floor, grinding them into dust beneath the heel of his polished boot. A violent spike of pure grief pierced my chest. He was not just destroying a piece of paper, he was burying the starving boy from the alleyway. "You are nothing," Vane snarled, his voice vibrating with absolute venom. "You are a cheap, temporary painkiller, a mortal inconvenience I no longer need to tolerate. Get out of my sight before I let my bride freeze the blood in your veins." My chest caved in. The rejection was a physical blow, stealing the oxygen from my lungs. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shatter his arrogant mask. But I was a survivor of the lower rings. I survived by seeing the tiny, fatal details that everyone else missed. I looked past his cruel sneer. I looked down at his hands. His fists were clenched so tight at his sides that the knuckles were stark white. Sharp, feral claws had involuntarily extended from his fingertips, burying deep into the meat of his own palms. He was mutilating himself. Thick drops of crimson blood slid down his wrists, hitting the ruined obsidian tiles with a soft, steady rhythm. The suffocating scent of his unspoken agony flooded the room. He was lying. He was tearing his own flesh apart to push me away. He was throwing me out to save me from the Ice Queen's wrath. I swallowed the bitter taste of heartbreak. I did not argue. I turned on my heel and walked toward the monolithic elevator doors. "I will leave," I whispered, not looking back. "But you are a terrible liar, Alpha." The steel doors slid shut, cutting off the sight of the broken king standing over the ashes of our past. The lower rings were submerged in a suffocating neon-lit smog. I walked fast, pulling my thin canvas jacket tighter around my shoulders. The encounter had left my nerves entirely frayed. The phantom warmth of his massive body still clung to my skin, a cruel, mocking reminder of the connection I had just lost. I needed to run. Huxley was right. If Odette discovered I was a living cure to her husband's leash, I was already dead. I turned into the narrow, decaying alleyway leading to my apartment block. The flickering street lamp buzzed overhead, casting long, distorted shadows against the brick walls. Then, my breath plumed into a thick cloud of white mist. The ambient temperature plummeted instantly. The damp puddles on the asphalt snapped into solid sheets of ice. A biting, unnatural wind swept through the confined space, carrying the sterile, chemical reek of liquid nitrogen. I stopped dead. The hairs on my arms stood on end. Stepping out from the suffocating darkness of the fire escape were 5 towering figures. They wore silver tactical armor that glinted like polished bone in the dim light. Their eyes were chips of glowing predatory blue, elite assassins of the Ice Wolf clan. And standing directly behind them, wrapped in her pristine white mink coat, was Odette. She looked entirely out of place in the grimy alley, yet she commanded the space like a goddess of winter. The ice heart relic glowed menacingly against her pale collarbone. Did he really think kicking you out would blind me to the truth? Odette smiled. It was a terrifying, hollow expression that did not reach her eyes. I smelled the elemental shift on his skin the second you touched him. I took a slow step backward. My hand instinctively reached for the heavy iron wrench still tucked into my belt. It was a pathetic weapon against apex predators, but I would not die on my knees. Odette's glacial eyes narrowed, zeroing in on my racing pulse. An unawakened soul weaver, she sneered, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. A filthy mortal anomaly. She raised a perfectly manicured hand, pointing a single diamond-ringed finger directly at my chest. Tear her apart. Bring me her heart. Chapter 5. The alley was a frozen death trap. I did not have claws. I did not have fangs. I was a fragile mortal cornered by apex predators. But I survived the slums because I never played by the rules. Before the first assassin could launch from the shadows, my hand dipped into my deep canvas pocket. I pulled the pin on a stolen industrial flare. I threw the metal cylinder directly at their armored boots. White-hot magnesium violently erupted. A blinding, searing flash ignited the confined space. The sharp, toxic scent of burning phosphorus entirely overpowered the suffocating liquid nitrogen. The elite wolves snarled, throwing their arms up, temporarily blinded by the intense chemical burn. I turned to run. A hand clamped onto my shoulder. It was freezing, but not with ice. It felt like absolute empty darkness. The alleyway instantly dissolved. Space twisted violently around me. My stomach dropped into a bottomless void, tearing the breath from my lungs. When my boots hit solid ground again, the nauseating scent of ozone filled the air. I was shoved into the passenger seat of an armored phantom sedan. Huxley slammed the door shut, taking the wheel. The dark mage's pale eyes were fixed on the neon-streaked road ahead. The engine roared with a silent electric hum. "There is a smuggler's ship at the western docks," Huxley stated flatly, hitting the accelerator. "It leaves in 10 minutes. You will be on it." I looked down at my trembling hands. The adrenaline was slowly receding, leaving a terrifying clarity behind. "Vane is signing the blood pact tonight." "He is signing his execution order," Huxley corrected. His grip tightened on the leather steering wheel until his knuckles popped. "Odette will drain him dry over the next decade, but you will be alive." I closed my eyes. I saw the silver crescent scar etched into his wrist. I felt the blistering, impossible heat of his skin, violently repressing his own deadly nature just to keep me safe. He was throwing himself into a permanent cage of ice so I could keep breathing. I opened my eyes. The street-bred fear was entirely gone. "Stop the car!" Huxley ignored me. The tires screeched as he whipped the sedan around a sharp, rain-slicked corner. I said, "Stop the damn car, Huxley." I lunged sideways, grabbing the steering wheel. The sedan swerved violently. Huxley cursed, slamming on the brakes. The vehicle skidded to a chaotic halt under a broken overpass. He turned to me, his eyes blazing with lethal dark magic. "Are you entirely suicidal? Odette will butcher you before you reach the altar." "I am a soul weaver," I whispered. The dormant truth rang with absolute, undeniable clarity in my chest. I am the only thing that can fix him. If he binds his soul to her, the curse will kill him anyway. I reached across the center console. My fingers clamped over the polished silver revolver resting in Huxley's open shoulder holster. I pulled it free. The weapon was exceptionally cold, loaded with lethal intent. I popped the cylinder, verifying the 6 silver-tipped hollow points resting inside. I snapped the barrel shut with a sharp, decisive click. "Take me to the cathedral." The Grand Cathedral of Obsidian Ridge was a towering monument to absolute, unchecked power. Inside, the air was suffocatingly thick. The scent of predatory elites, expensive perfumes, and ancient wolf musk choked the vaulted halls. Thousands of high-born shifters stood in complete silence. At the altar, Odette looked like a flawless vision of lethal winter. Beside her, Vane was a hollow shell. He held a ceremonial silver blade over the ancient parchment of the blood pact. The cursed veins on his neck were throbbing, a dull, agonizing crimson against his unnaturally pale skin. He looked utterly defeated, a feral king surrendering his crown to the frost. He raised the blade to his palm. I did not knock. I raised the silver revolver and pulled the trigger. The gunshot was a deafening thunderclap. It completely shattered the locking mechanism of the colossal oak doors. Wood splinters rained down like shrapnel onto the polished marble. Every single head in the cathedral snapped toward the entrance. 1,000 glowing, predatory eyes locked onto me. I stood framed in the fractured doorway, backlit by the neon glow of the city outside, blood on my torn dress, gun entirely steady, eyes unshaking. "Whoever dares to sign a marriage pact with my man," my voice echoed through the cavernous hall, sharp and completely fearless, "will swallow silver." A collective horrified gasp rippled through the high-born ranks. Vane dropped the ceremonial blade. It clattered loudly against the altar. The dead, empty look in his eyes instantly shattered. A sudden, terrifyingly feral possessiveness flared to life, burning right through the icy suppression of the room. "Lark," he breathed. The sound was a desperate, starving prayer. Before he could take a single step toward me, the ambient temperature in the cathedral violently collapsed. A supersonic shockwave of pure, unadulterated hatred blasted from the altar. Odette's pristine illusion fractured, her jaw unhinged with a sickening pop. In a fraction of a second, the beautiful queen dissolved into a towering, colossal beast of jagged ice and frosted fur. The ice wolf roared. The sound vibrated with enough force to crack the stained glass windows lining the ceiling. She did not lunge at Vane. She lunged directly at me. I raised the gun, aiming steadily for the beast's glowing blue eyes. But she was unnaturally fast. Odette swiped her lethal, frost-coated limb. A blinding javelin of solid, compressed ice materialized in the freezing air. It shot across the center aisle with the velocity of a fired missile. I did not even have time to blink. The impact was catastrophic. The jagged ice spear pierced directly through the center of my chest. The revolver slipped from my numb fingers, clattering uselessly against the stone floor. The pain was entirely blinding, erasing the opulent cathedral in a wash of agonizing white light. The bitter cold instantly flooded my lungs, freezing the scream in my throat. My knees buckled. I collapsed onto the pristine crimson carpet. A warm, dark pool of blood instantly spread beneath me, melting the frost. So this was how it ended. Not running, not hiding, just fighting for him. The last thing I heard before the absolute darkness swallowed me was a roar. It was not a roar of anger. It was the apocalyptic, earth-shattering scream of an alpha king watching his entire universe die. Chapter 6. The roar shattered the physical boundaries of the world. It was not a sound born from rage. It was the apocalyptic, earth-shattering scream of a soul being violently ripped in half. The ice wolf's spear had pierced my chest. The agonizing cold paralyzed my heart. I lay motionless on the crimson carpet, entirely submerged in a pool of my own darkening blood. Then the sanctuary burned. Vane did not transform. He transcended. The Sun-Devourer curse, suppressed for 15 agonizing years, detonated with the catastrophic force of a dying star. If she was gone, the world had absolutely no right to exist. The vaulted ceiling of the grand cathedral instantly blackened. The ancient stone pillars cracked, glowing a furious molten orange. The stained glass windows exploded outward, vaporized into glittering dust before they could even hit the ground. A blinding solar flare heat erupted from the Alpha King. The elite ice assassins lunged forward to protect their queen. They never reached him. The moment they stepped into his agonizing radius, their silver armor glowed white-hot. They collapsed into piles of smoking ash before a single scream could escape their throats. The aristocratic crowd scrambled toward the exits like panicked prey, stripping away their high-born dignity in the face of true, feral annihilation. The sheer gravity of Vane's aura pressed the slower elites directly into the stone floor. Odette stumbled backward. Her colossal wolf form shrank rapidly as the blistering heat dissolved her frosty domain. She raised the Ice Heart relic, desperately trying to summon a defensive blizzard. "You think you won?" Odette sneered, coughing up freezing blood as her illusion melted away. "You just broke him." Vane moved with the velocity of light. His hand, wreathed in literal roaring flames, clamped directly around Odette's throat, cutting off her words. He lifted the Ice Wolf Queen entirely off the marble floor. The legendary relic around her neck cracked violently under the impossible thermal pressure. "You," his voice was a demonic overlapping chorus of pure annihilation. "You took her from me." He threw Odette across the cathedral. Her body collided with the stone altar, snapping it cleanly in half. She slumped into the debris, entirely paralyzed by overwhelming predatory terror. The invincible winter had been obliterated by the sun, but Vane did not finish her. The bloodlust abruptly vanished. He spun around, the roaring flames consuming his body extinguished instantly. The catastrophic heat was violently replaced by a frantic, suffocating terror. He dropped to his knees beside my unmoving body. The towering tyrant, the apex predator of the entire territory, was trembling like a frightened child. He reached out, his soot-stained hands hesitating in the air. He was terrified that touching me would cause further pain. Finally, he gathered my limp form into his arms. He pulled me flush against his chest, burying his face into the crook of my neck. My blood soaked into his ruined silk shirt, binding us together in the most tragic way possible. "No," Vane whispered. The absolute desolation in his voice was catastrophic. "Lark, open your eyes. Look at me." My skin was cold. The fatal spear of ice had melted, leaving a devastating hollow wound behind. I could not answer him. I could not pull the air into my shattered lungs. My pulse was a faded memory. A guttural, devastated sob tore from his throat. The sound echoed through the ruined, smoking cathedral. Thousands of high-born aristocrats watched from the periphery in absolute silence. They witnessed their ruthless sovereign completely break. His alpha instincts violently rejected reality, an invisible wolf howling its grief into the hollow chambers of his mind. He rocked me back and forth, pressing frantic, desperate kisses into my hair. "You promised," he choked out, his golden eyes entirely devoid of light. "You promised the wild boy would not steal the last thing you had left. You lied. You took my entire world." The grief morphed into a terrifying, fatal resolve. If I could not breathe, he refused to breathe without me. The bond was undeniable now. A life without his mate was not a life he was willing to endure. Vane gently laid my head against his thigh. He looked down at my pale, lifeless face with an expression of profound, eternal devotion. Slowly he raised his right hand. Lethal obsidian claws extended from his fingertips. He did not aim for the enemy. He aimed the razor-sharp tips directly over his own heart. "I will find you in the dark, my little bird," he murmured, his muscles tightening for the fatal strike. "I am coming." He drove his claws downward. In that exact suspended fraction of a second, a single drop of water fell from his jaw. The Alpha King's tear landed directly onto the fatal bloody wound in the center of my chest. The impact defied all laws of mortality. A blinding, incandescent silver light violently erupted from the point of contact. The shockwave of pure, unadulterated energy knocked Vane's hand away, throwing him entirely off balance. The silver radiance instantly consumed my body, lifting me several inches off the ruined carpet into suspended levitation. The scent of scorched ozone and blood was aggressively erased by the vibrant, intoxicating aroma of a sudden spring rain. A resonant, crystalline hum vibrated through the air, rattling the teeth of everyone present. The fractured edges of my flesh began to knit together with impossible speed. Deep within my frozen chest, a dead heart violently kick-started. Vane froze, his breath entirely hitching in his throat. He stared at my glowing chest, a fresh wave of agony hitting his amber eyes. He thought his shattered mind was finally breaking. He thought I was a cruel, beautiful hallucination conjured by his dying sanity, until my fingers twitched, and I dragged a sharp, desperate breath of air into my lungs. Chapter 7. The silver light did not just heal flesh. It rewrote reality. I dragged a sharp, desperate breath of air into my lungs. My eyelids fluttered open, greeted by the catastrophic ruin of the grand cathedral. But my focus immediately locked onto the man kneeling beside me. Vane was entirely frozen. His amber eyes were wide, tracking the subtle rise and fall of my chest with absolute disbelief. A tear cut a clean line through the soot on his jaw. He thought his shattered mind was projecting a cruel, beautiful hallucination. I raised my trembling hand. My fingertips brushed against his cheek. "I am right here," I whispered. The physical contact broke the spell. Vane let out a sound that defied description, a fractured, overwhelming collision of a sob and a territorial snarl. He crushed me against his chest, his arms locked around me like iron bands, burying his face into my hair. He was inhaling my scent with a starving, frantic desperation, memorizing the steady rhythm of my resurrected heartbeat. But the danger was not over. The Sun Devourer curse, enraged by its temporary suppression, began to violently boil beneath his skin once more. The molten heat flared, threatening to consume him entirely. This time, I did not just soothe it, I destroyed it. The dormant Soul Weaver bloodline within me fully awakened. An ocean of incandescent silver energy poured from my core, rushing directly into his infected veins. I did not fight the fire. I unraveled it. I placed both hands over his chest, right above his heart. The silver light violently dragged the curse outward. Ethereal black ash expelled from his pores, immediately purified by the radiant aura surrounding us. The suffocating scent of ozone and scorched blood was permanently replaced by the crisp, undeniable fragrance of a thunderstorm breaking over a pine forest. Vane threw his head back, his jaw clenching as decades of agonizing torment were violently ripped from his soul. The glowing, corrupted veins on his neck faded into nothingness. The unnatural, blistering heat dissolved into a profound, soothing warmth. For the first time in 15 years, the Alpha King was entirely free. He looked down at me. His golden eyes were clear, flawless, and burning with a terrifyingly possessive devotion. A harsh, wet cough echoed through the ruined sanctuary. Odette was pinned beneath the shattered remnants of the stone altar. Her white mink coat was stained with ash and her own freezing blood. The ice heart relic around her neck was nothing more than pulverized dust. The aristocratic crowd had completely vanished, leaving her entirely abandoned by the very elites she ruled. Huxley stepped out of the lingering smoke, his silver-tipped cane tapping rhythmically against the marble. A dozen heavily armed enforcers from Vane's inner circle flanked the dark mage, their weapons trained directly on the fallen Ice Wolf Queen. "Take her to the subterranean cells," Vane commanded. His voice was a glacial, lethal rumble that demanded absolute obedience. "Ensure she never sees the sun again." The guards hauled Odette to her feet. Her pristine illusion was completely ruined. But as they dragged her toward the shadows, the deposed queen twisted her head back. She spat a mouthful of freezing blood onto the carpet and smiled. It was a manic, chilling expression. "You think the curse is gone, Vane?" Odette laughed, the sound scraping like a rusted blade against the stone. "No, it only just changed masters." Her chilling words hung in the air as the heavy doors of the cathedral were dragged shut, plunging her into eternal darkness. 1 year later, the throne room of Obsidian Ridge was entirely submerged in a suffocating, powerful silence. I sat cross-legged on the monolithic obsidian throne. The cold, black stone contrasted sharply against my deep crimson evening gown. In my lap rested the silver revolver. I calmly wiped a fresh streak of dark blood from the polished barrel using a square of imported silk. The syndicate opposition had attempted a violent coup an hour ago. They failed catastrophically. The lower rings were learning a brutal lesson. The new queen did not negotiate with traitors. A towering shadow detached itself from the gloom behind the throne. Vane moved with the silent, lethal grace of an apex predator. He wore a crisp, tailored black shirt, the sleeves rolled up to expose the silver crescent scar on his wrist. The curse was permanently eradicated, but the dark, bloodthirsty instinct of the Alpha King remained entirely intact. He stepped up behind the throne. Vane leaned down, his broad chest pressing firmly against my back. I tilted my head, willingly offering him access. He buried his face into the sensitive crook of my neck. I felt the phantom brush of his teeth grazing my collarbone, a lethal threat wrapped in an agonizingly tender caress. He inhaled deeply, drawing the scent of gunpowder and my steady pulse into his lungs. The sound of his deep, rumbling purr vibrated directly into my spine. He was the most dangerous creature in the territory, a tyrant who could level cities with a single command. But in this room, he belonged entirely to me. He pressed a slow, fiercely possessive kiss against my skin. "My queen," Vane whispered, his voice a gravelly, intoxicating rasp that sent a shiver straight through my core. He reached over, his calloused fingers gently taking the silver gun from my hands, tossing it carelessly onto the floor. "This world is yours." He turned my chin, forcing my gaze to meet his burning golden eyes. "But you are forever mine." I smiled, leaning up to capture his lips. We were not heroes. We were an anomaly forged in blood and silver, two apex predators, perfectly aligned in the dark, ruling the underworld exactly as we pleased.